So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Beatriz. I'm the acting director of the Mexican Cultural Institute, the House of the Public and Cultural Diplomacy of Mexico in the United States. And on behalf of Ambassador Marta Bárcena, I am honored to give you the warmest welcome to a full-day program on religion in Mexican politics, migration, and Mexican-American communities in the span of 100 years. 1920 to 2020, which are almost coincidental with the years Mexico has made history in this mansion. First as the Embassy of Mexico, and then for almost 30 years as the Mexican Cultural Institute. Moreover, a reflection of who we are and where are we going, and the embracing understanding of the tenets of popular culture in Mexico and Mexican America are priorities of the new cultural diplomacy strategy envisioned by the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this program fits beautifully in this effort. Therefore, I'm giving the importance of the historic perspective in the following 2 years, 2020 being the 30th anniversary of the Mexican Cultural Institute, and 2021, when we will commemorate 500 years of the fall of Tenochtitlan, 200 years of independent Mexico, and 100 years, as mentioned, of the arrival of Mexico in this house. I like to think this event as a kickoff of a series of academic endeavors reflecting on our past, present, and future. We see this as the first of a series of, hopefully, a series of academic collaborations in this direction. And I cannot thank enough the co-sponsors of this initiative, Georgetown University through the Americas Initiative, the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and the Center for Latin American Studies, as well as the Catholic University of America. And in particular, all our appreciation to Professor John Tutino, needless to say, a seminal and influential figure in the study of Mexican history and a very dear friend of the Mexican Cultural Institute, for thinking of us as hosts for this initiative. And we are very proud to have you all speakers here with us today, and I wish you a very fruitful day of reflections on Mexican America on this very important topic, and I give now the floor to Professor Tutino. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatriz. And the first thing I must say is thank you so much for hosting us there. As people have heard me say, this is my favorite place in Washington. I feel like I'm in Mexico, which in fact we are. This is Mexico in Washington. So again, thank you so much, Beatriz. But the next thing I need to emphasize is that sort of briefly how this happened. Late last spring, I got an email jointly from Julia Young, then Fallaw, and you need to recognize who they are. And this program is their idea. They wrote me and said, we should do a program on religion in Mexican politics, etc. My first reaction was, of course. My second reaction, and this is my hang-up, I said, and we have to stretch it from your guys' period to the present and bring it so that we start in the mid-20th century and arrive at the challenges of the early 21st century. They immediately said, of course. And we set about ruminating on who to invite. And I want to say it, as I hope you'll appreciate in the course of the day, you will hear from some of the most distinguished, established scholars of 20th century Mexico, of religion and politics on both sides of the border. But we were really pleased to sort of learn about young people we didn't know were working or just starting to work on this. And so, to us, the mix of established scholars and new emerging creative voices is really what I think is going to make the day work. There will be lunch, refreshments for the day. Enjoy, stay with us as long as you can. And I want to say thank you so much. And I want to give Julia and or Ben the chance to say a word or two, because it's all their fault.
Patron, really, the patron saint of Mexican studies in Washington, D.C. And thank you for his support. Thank you. And I remember it differently. I remember it I'm so excited about the program for today, and I hope you will be too. And enjoy.
I just want to say briefly, in addition to all the things that Julia said, I had a half-baked idea, which Julia turned into a more complete idea, and then John turned into a real reality. So thanks to John, thanks to all the institutions, Beatriz Nava in particular for opening this wonderful facility. As someone who's taken advantage of the hospitality and generosity of the Mexican people to share their history with me for the past 30 years, I think I'm too young for a bucket list, but certainly this is a lifetime opportunity, and I'm so happy, and certainly thanks to everyone for joining us, and we were so happy to hear positive responses for so many established and younger scholars, and this has turned into, thanks to all the support, into a wonderful program. So enjoy, and thanks for being with us.
I just want to quickly, I'm pass this over, so I want to quickly welcome Karin Rosemblatt, who has joined us and will moderate this session. And the key I want to emphasize for everything is we're going to have presentations. We'll, I think, do them in order, but then we hope there will be at least a half hour at the end of every session for open conversation. Be ready to join in, participate, and engage. And I want to emphasize briefly that Karin Rosemblatt is professor of history, director of historical studies at the University of Maryland. We all first knew her as an amazingly distinguished scholar of women and gender in Chile, and then she suddenly emerged as a world-class historian of Mexico. And I'm going to rat her out a little bit. Her recent book, The Science and Politics of Race in Mexico and the United States, 1910 to 1950, that kind of does intersect with what we're doing here today, won the Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers for U.S. history as the best book, and for a book that's half on Mexico. To win the Prose Award in U.S. history, I want to say, wow, and welcome.
It was North American history.
North America, yes. Even so.
Yes, I'm
Even
pleased.
so.
Well, I'm delighted to be chairing this panel. You guys are in for a real treat, and I'm in for a treat. Ben, I first met about 15 years ago. Elizabeth, I met a year ago. Matt, I am meeting for the first time, which is lovely. And Julia, I'm very fortunate to interact with at least once a semester here in Washington, D.C. So this is really a pleasure for me. And I know I'm going to learn a lot about religion and politics, which is the title of our panel today. First up, we are going to hear from one of the organizers of this event, Ben Fallaw. He is professor at Colby College, where he also directs the Latin American Studies Center. He's the author of Cardenas Compromise, The Failure of Reform in Post-Revolutionary Yucatan, 2001. And more recently, Religion and State Formation in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, 2013. The title of his talk today is Soy Guadalupe la Agraria y con el progreso voy, Dissident Catholics and the Limits of Revolutionary Christianity, 1922 to 1931.
Thank you. The name of my paper is Soy Guadalupe la Agraria y con el progreso voy. Slight change, and I apologize for not informing you anti-clericals Catholic known as the Revolutionary Christianity. Sometime in 1931, Felix Ramirez, a músico Veracruz literal, penned an 8-page epic poem entitled Explanations from La Guadalupana to Juan Diego. In it, a pura revolucionaria Virgin tells Juan Diego that she is a, quote, Republican Indian and, quote, a sister of humble democracy. Furthermore, she describes herself as Soy Guadalupe la Agraria y con el progreso voy. Roughly, I am Guadalupe, the agrarian reformer in favor of breaking up the large estates and giving land to peasants. And I go with progress, a loaded term in early 20th century Mexico that usually implied at least secularization, if not dismantling much of not just the political but the cultural influence of the Catholic Church. We know of this poem because on November 20th, 1931, many of you recognize the date, as Day of the Revolution, Ramirez sent it to Tomas Garrido Caraval, who archived it along with his response. As a lot of you know, Garrido was a Tabascan strongman and two-time governor, a fiery comecora, priest eater, someone who was proud to be an enemy of the Catholic Church, whose influence was growing at this time over revolutionary politicians and educators. In fact, his archive contains hundreds of letters from across Mexico from anti-clericals of all stripes seeking his approval, advice, moral support, periodicals, jobs, money, and all manner of favors. Garrido curtly replied in this case to Ramirez that, quote, "It is not enough to regulate religion, it must be suppressed. It is not enough to be anti-clerical, it is necessary to be an atheist." Explaining the explanation. Because Ramirez's explanations challenges the idea that revolutionaries and Catholics in Mexico were two hostile, mutually exclusive groups during most of the long Mexican Revolution, as Mary Kay Ball has said, from 1910 to 1940, this document deserves a closer examination. Let's start with the author. I know frustratingly little about Ramirez. I do know he owned a small shoe factory in Huatusco and was in state Congress briefly in 1916-17 under noted anti-clerical governor Alberto Tejeda. The local chronicler of Huatusco remembers him as a leading Freemason, crediting the craft with his philanthropic spirit and support for local education. Ramirez, in writing to Garrido, explained that he hoped his poem would, quote, enlighten 4 or 5 of Huatusco's benighted people by, quote, freeing them from error, end quote. Although Ramirez shared with many other Freemasons an enthusiasm for indigenism, or love and appreciation, sometimes in a patronizing way by non-indigenous people for indigenous culture, his pen name was Berkley, or Eagle. His religious ideas were far from Masonic orthodoxy. Ramirez was definitely not part of a vast conspiracy involving Freemasons, Protestant missionaries, and liberal Mexican politicians that some on the far right imagined at the time. And recent research reveals that Masonry's impact on the post-revolutionary politics has been exaggerated because careerism, infighting, and in Vince Smith's words, essentially conservative leadership consistently hindered its influence. Although I noticed when I came in, the Scottish Rite temple is right across the street.
We brought them in.
Yeah. By 1931, Ramirez was out of public life. He was not that important. Although given the paucity of sources, I should be careful in assuming too much. After all, as Paul Vanderwood reminds us, that in Tonchi, Chihuahua, the leading advocate of secular progress, there's that word again, and anti-clericalism, was, quote, the village SOB, although Vanderwood uses slightly different terms to describe it. Now, if we look at the chronology and the timing, which is where historians without a lot of information often fall back to, we can get maybe some insights, but we need to take a detour into La Guadalupana's origins and revolutionary high politics. He dated his poem December 14, 1931. As I found out, December 13th is the day of La Guadalupana's 5th and last apparition to Tepeyac. So is Ramirez implying that the church spun a false narrative hiding La Guadalupana's last revelations, sort of a Mexican Da Vinci Code? He seems to be sort of hinting at this. In national politics, since at least March 1931, supporters of Maximo Chief Plutarco de las Calles, like Garrido Cannibal, were advocating a new wave of anti-revolutionary clericalism, or revolutionary anti-clericalism. Tensions were peaking when he wrote and sent his poem to Garrido, and chose the day of revolution, probably to belie any suspicions of fanaticism. It seems not to work in this case. And shortly after his correspondence with Garrido began, radicals seized on the public massive celebration of the 400th anniversary of La Guadalupana's apparition, December 12, 1931, to justify another harsh crackdown on the church. Now, if we look a little deeper in Ramirez's poem, he describes a Guadalupana idea radically reimagined. It denies her divinity, predictably perhaps, and puts her on the left of Mexican history. His Guadalupe lauds not just 19th century patriotic heroes like Hidalgo, Morelos, and Guerrero, none of them explicitly anti-clerical, but also the secular Republican Benito Juarez. At least one Catholic defends Juarez and says he was not anti-clerical, but also unambiguously anti-clerical politicians like Tejeda and Calles. Ramirez's Guadalupana blessed the grand reform, a signal triumph of the revolution, opposed by the church for the most part, Could this revolutionary Guadalupanismo have been, as Galvez argues in the case of Guadalupanismo among Mexican Americans in contemporary New York, a way for those who identified with the revolution and Catholicism to create, in her words, modalities and collective organization and reimagine their own identities? I think it's a suggestive idea here. His ideas do differ from other attempts by revolutionaries to engage with Christianity. Revolutionary intellectuals might call Christ the first socialist, but they generally had little good to say about the Virgin of Guadalupe. Perhaps because their old foes, the Zapatistas and Cristeros, took her as their symbol. Misogyny might be a factor too, and I think that's worth talking about. At just 10 years before he wrote, the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe at the Basilica in Tepeyac had been bombed. It escaped damage by a sympathizer with the revolution. And in reprisal, of course, for the 400th anniversary, the federal district incorporated the Villa Guadalupe into the Distrito Federal as the Delegación Gustavo A. Madero. Although Calles apparently blocked demands to place the famed image of the Virgin into a museum run by the state where she would be desacralized, symbolically relegated to the past, and perhaps subject to empirical study. We don't know what Gonzalo Santos, who seemed to be pushing this idea, had in mind. In seeking to reconcile the revolution and Catholicism, Ramirez might have been isolated in Huatusco. In fact, he seems to be. But seen in a broader context, he's not alone in this sort of wide middle ground between Garrido's uncompromising atheism and a kind of recalcitrant, very conservative Catholicism advanced by people like Bishop Jose de Jesus Manriquez and the National League for the Defense of Religious Liberty. In recent years, a number of historians have problematized this false binary between religion and revolution by carefully examining, in Butler's words, the genuine religious ferment sparked by the revolution. Through my remaining time, I want to chart two other much more significant places in this middle ground, separatist Catholicism and non-Christian alternatives, and then explain why they failed, and then turn my remaining time to Catholic responses to these efforts. In this middle ground, we could have been filled by a schismatic or independent or separate or dissident Catholicism. And this is a religious community self-identifying as Catholic and retaining some Catholic beliefs, but rejecting papal authority. At several junctions in Mexican history, the state has fostered separatist Catholic movements. Butler talks about ICAM a lot, and he proves in his work that ICAM, or the Iglesia Apostólica Católica Mexicana, was not just an attempt to dupe Catholics with counterfeit clergy. There was much more to that. It retained, among other things, the Virgin of Guadalupe, while rejecting other parts of Catholicism. Now, we do see less ambitious and less successful tentative efforts by two presidents and several military governors. And we see efforts by some revolutionary politicians that claim the patronato, that's to say, the right to appoint bishops and presumably priests, various times in the late teens, the 1920s. Also, at various times, politicians in the revolutionary state brought up the idea of outlawing the tithe, outlawing spoken or regular confession, outlawing priestly celibacy as ways to force the Catholic Church to reform itself, sort of from without, with coercive means. Now, as I'll discuss, these attempts never really gained ground aside from econ. Arguably, the most influential and widely read anti-clerical text during this long revolutionary period was a very interesting short book or tract called Catecismo de las Doctrinas Socialistas, penned by Chihuahuan from Parral and Alfredo Lugo. This Catecismo included socialist versions of Our Father, Hail Mary, Good Works, Seven Sins, and Virtues. His 10 Commandments, or social 10 Commandments, had the familiar first commandment as well as a very different fifth. Do not kill time with vices and pleasures. And ninth, do not desire to be the boss of the workshop, factory, or farm that's becoming a tyrant. Now, this was not a diabolic or Bolshevik satire, as some believed, or simply cribbing from European socialists. In fact, if we look at Lugo, we see somebody with deep anarcho-syndicalist and very Mexican roots. He was a member of the Magonista movement, the anarcho-syndicalist workers' radical movement before the revolution. He'd been thrown in jail by Porfirio Diaz and was sort of the hero of the revolution, at least for a while. He ran for office once in 1920, but like a lot of these old Magonistas, he generally faded from public life and eliminated himself from politics and died unknown in 1935. Now, the Catecismo can be read in different ways. For me, it's the blueprint for a sort of post-Christian religion and what he imagined a revolutionary society might become, at least in the early 1920s. And what's interesting about this document is it's widely reprinted during the 1920s and 30s by labor leaders, Freemasons, Lázaro Cárdenas' political party, and of course, Garrido Cannavaro, for a while seems to have been interested in it. And I think the fact that many revolutionary politicians were interested in it and seems to advance it, were interested in the idea of a social morality or ethics without a notion of deity. In Lugo's words, those who followed his Catecismo would be guided by a free conscience and the principles of solidarity, equality, and fraternity. So why did these revolutionary alternatives largely fail? Like the analogous Church of Humanity that Auguste Comte came up with, there is a church in Brazil, not well attended, dedicated to this religion or Church of Humanity. The Catecismo, the Socialist Catecismo, converted few, if any. But the fact that it was so widely printed and distributed, I think, speaks to the kind of metaphysical brio the revolution touched off. So why did these attempts fail? Well, for starters, the state seemed to be more than happy to sort of barter away support for alternatives to Catholicism in favor of other goals. And sometimes this is pragmatic politics due to resistance from Catholics in Mexico and pressure from the United States. And certainly by the 1930s, the spread of, I think, a kind of hyper-materialism inspired by Garrido, and also the Communist Party, which was small but influential, ruled out any state support for a kind of revolutionary Christianity. Acts of iconicalism by soldiers and teachers alienated a lot of Catholics and possibly potential converts. And finally, and I hope we can talk about this later, anti-clericalism, as others noted, was overwhelmingly male. And I think gender is an important variable that's worth talking about. Now, when we look at things like Lugo's text, I think Matthew's given us a very important reading here, that it's difficult to escape the church's influence in a country like Mexico. And one time studying Guanajuato, I found a quote by a revolutionary. He said, even in Guanajuato, even the anti-clericals are Catholic. Right? He was outraged. It was just impossible, in the Bajío at least, the Rosary Belt, to escape the influence of the church. It was so deeply in the ether, right? But I think that Lugo's Catecismo also speaks to the difficulty of creating a new religion without liturgy or ritual that could be embedded in daily life. There were socialist or revolutionary marriages and baptism, but these were really spectacles and never caught on. Commenting on the Freemasons, apologies to across the road, solstice rituals, Ben Smith finds them abstemious and apparently rather solemn festivals with orange juice sandwich and crepe paper. And they lack what in John Coatsworth is called Catholicism psychic splendors. And I think there's more quotidian versions of that as well. As one of the horsemen of the New Atheism, Daniel Dennison once said, no one wants to sing atheism. Catholic resistance and accommodation of revolutionary religious projects. Now, the Catholic Church was not sitting on its hands while all of this was going on. It was alert, certainly, to the possibility of schism and energetically opposed it, and apparently minimized clerical defections, although I think it's worth looking closely at the diocesan level to see this. Publicly, Rome defended the Patronato and what it called the Pope Pius XI in 1929 called internal church governance, and recognized, called out by name, the Mexican state's threat to it. Now, one historian of Mexican Catholicism has argued that while the Panismo became more conservative, more nationalist, more Hispanist, more anti-liberal, and more anti-U.S. American, because of anti-clerical pragmatism in the wake of the fourth centennial of the Virgin Guadalupe's apparition, I think it's worth talking about and examining that. That's certainly one possible reaction. But I think we need much more research to look at what the Catholic clergy and laity were saying and doing in response to the prospect of a separatist Catholicism, right? Did liberal ideas, did resentment of Spanish priests in many dioceses by Mexican priests, did this respond, right? Was there any resonance here? How did people feel about attempts to suppress folk Catholicism or popular Catholicism, right? And again, I think this is worth looking more deeply at. Now, two scholars have shown some of the ways that Catholics found their way to this kind of middle ground short of a separatist or dissident Catholic movement. One, Patience Shell, criticizes the focus on the Cristero Order, right? And argues that the church and revolutionary state at times work together on parallel tracks, right? Collaborating, for instance, in trying to change the habits of working class families in Mexico City. Catholic citizens of Mexico City, she argues in the 20s and 30s, accepted help from the revolutionary state, especially for their children, and thus realized some of the goals of the revolution in their lives. Christina Boylan has examined cases of bigamy and annulment trials brought by Catholics before the Archdiocese of Mexico's matrimonial tribunal. Although the church criticized the divorce law of 1917 and the 1938 Civil Code as threats to a moral social order, Catholic litigants, most of them women, coming before this tribunal, often invoked secular and, in a sense, revolutionary notions of individual happiness and a companionate marriage. That's to say, marriage based not primarily on sacramental motives, but on an emotionally intimate friendship. And to make their cases to the church, they invoke these ideas, and she argues they could have used them as sort of leverage in relationships as well. By way of conclusion, so this long revolution, 1910-40, profoundly altered Mexico's spiritual topography. If we look in this middle ground in 1940, there are a few organized alternatives to Catholicism, but very few. ECOM certainly was much more widespread and popular than we thought. Jason Dormati has looked at groups that are still around, like Luz del Mundo and New Jerusalem. Luz del Mundo, I think, has been in the news a lot more recently. As well as non-Christian movements. One, the Magnetic Spiritual School, started by a Catalan electrician who immigrated to Argentina, at one point had dozens of lodges across Mexico. Protestantism was small but spreading in 1940. Some argue Garrido preferred Protestantism as the lesser of two evils. And in southern Mexico, certainly this is a place where Protestantism is beginning to growing slowly in the 40s. Catholicism has changed to Sanarquismo, a pacifist paramilitary, was on the march, as Julia is researching. And as Matthew will speak to today, the Montezuma Seminary was churning out muscular militant priests across the border. So let me close where I started. If Felix Ramirez came back today, he would see Catholic depictions of the Virgin Guadalupe all over Mexico. He might be horrified to hear that Vicente Fox moved to the Basilica on his inauguration day. But he also might find comfort in seeing a multitude of very secular representations of her all around him, tattoos hanging from rearview mirror taxis, as an icon claimed by Neo Zapatistas and the subject of radical reimagining by feminist artists, right? But the revolution could not, or would not achieve what has been done by the transformative effects of what we used to call modernization and globalization. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Next up is Elizabeth O'Brien. Elizabeth is assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, and she is working on a book entitled Intimate Interventions, The Cultural Politics of Reproductive Surgery in Mexico, 1790 to 1940. Her talk today is titled A Struggle for the Soul of the Nation, Mexican Eugenics and the Catholic Church's Response, 1925 to 1938.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, good morning. I'm very, very glad to be here today, and I'm so grateful to Georgetown University, a Catholic University of America, and Professor Fallaw, Professor Young, Professor Tutino, for the invitation to be here with everyone today at the Mexican Cultural Institute. Thank you also to my fellow panelists for starting a very, very interesting conversation. and I will be taking a bit of a different approach from the history of medicine side. My interests are in the intersections between gender, religion, science, and the state in Mexico. And I'll start by showing you this cartoon, which was drawn by a rebellious medical student in the early 1930s at Mexico's National University. Here, he's clearly criticizing some of his professors and clinical medical instructors by depicting them in a negative light and by making commentary on the kinds of research and experimentation that they were performing on their patients in the public clinics. I'll come back to that in a minute. But first I'll give a brief sketch of my talk, which will start with a very basic definition of eugenics, and we'll talk a bit about the history of eugenics in Mexico. I'll give examples of the implementation of some of these eugenic ideas and its practice. And then I will discuss the intersections between scientific medicine, broadly defined, the secularization of Mexico's hospital system, and anti-Catholic reforms in Mexico's hospitals after the revolution. Finally, I will discuss a variety of Catholic responses to eugenics in Mexico. And these came from officials such as the Archbishop, but then there are also all kinds of other ways that patients, medical students, doctors, and other community leaders challenge eugenics and argue for the continuation of a hospital system based on religious charity and benevolent philanthropy. And that's why I wanted to use this picture as an entry point into the talk. I think it serves nicely as a reminder that throughout the history of the contentious topics I'll discuss, such as eugenics, medical ethics, sterilization, and fertility control, that the Mexican medical community, the religious healing community, the medical student community, and the patient community had multivalent and complex positions about science, religion, and the role of medical practitioners in the formation of a national community. Very quickly, I'll start with Francis Galton in order to provide a brief definition of eugenics, which I think is important because the word can mean so many different things. It was a malleable category that really never meant the same thing at the same time and place and was specific and had a particular meaning in Mexico. So in 1883, when Sir Francis Galton first came up with the term, he defined it as, quote, the science of improving the human population. And over time, he fine-tuned the definition so that in 1909, he described it as a science that, quote, deals with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, also with those that develop them to the utmost advantage. So Galton formulated eugenics as an interventionist science that would encourage breeding among society's putatively superior classes and discourage procreation among those classified as inferior. However, he provided a few details about actionable policies or legislation, and so his ideas were fundamentally open to interpretation. And by the early 20th century, as processes of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration intensified around the globe, many social reformers became enamored of eugenics in different ways and began to apply ideas of heredity and biological improvement to their own cultural milieux. In Mexico, these ideas really took root during the reign of Porfirio Diaz, when a cadre of intellectuals known as científicos drew from Comtean positivism and social Darwinism to anxiously envision a Europeanized society that would trend towards whiteness in phenotype and culture. From the perspective of most científicos, people with indigenous, African, or Asian ancestry were roadblocks to progress that either could be excluded or wholly absorbed into a whitening body politic. In the early 20th century, this rendition was challenged by a generation of revolutionary literati such as Andrés Molina Enríquez, whose 1909 book, Los Grandes Problemas Nacionales, rejected the veneration of whiteness and instead elevated the mestizo as the superlative type that would lead Mexico stalwartly forward. José Vasconcelos popularized this viewpoint as part of a post-revolutionary doctrine in the 1920s with the publication of his well-known book, La Raza Cósmica. After the Mexican Revolution, while we can definitely point to cultural and intellectual resistance to European and American-style eugenics, concerns about racial mixture, indigenous culture, and social degeneration nonetheless ensured that many elites were compelled Mexican physicians to turn their attention towards reproduction, childhood, and motherhood, that important nexus where future generations are born and nurtured. Prior to Nancy Stephen's highly influential work on eugenics, historians tended to characterize a Latin American style focus on better breeding as a sign that Latin American eugenics or eugenics in Catholic countries were more, they use the language positive, than the so-called negative eugenics of Germany and the United States, with their focus on sterilization. But rather than viewing eugenics as either positive or negative, Nancy Stephen proposed the category of preventative eugenics as a framework to contextualize policies and practices implemented in Latin America. In her words, preventative eugenics strove to advance the nation by cleansing from the milieu those factors considered to be damaging to people's health. And so what happened in Mexico was interesting because those factors, the ones that were allegedly damaging to people's health according to eugenicists, not only included some kinds of scientific measurements, which exhibited prejudice against indigenous people, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but also many scientists and some of the medical students and doctors that I'll quote saw Catholicism itself as a factor that was damaging to people's health. So in other words, the point is that in the 1930s especially, there was this battle for the soul of the nation, and that this battle played out rather dramatically in hospitals and clinics. On the one hand, we had the new state's scientific efforts to cultivate culturally reformed and even revolutionized subjects through the application of medicine, and on the other hand, we have the Catholic response. But first, let's give some examples of how eugenic ideologies affected medicine in hospitals in Mexico. So, as a historian of medicine, I look to surgical records in order to examine these questions that lie at the intersection of fertility control, surgical ethics, experimentation, and sterilization. And very briefly, to sum up what I found, is that these issues divided students of the medical schools in the 1930s in quite a dramatic way. They even contributed to massive turnover in the Office of Public Health and Welfare, and also contributed to the restructuring of that organization, the Office of Public Health and Welfare, and thereby the restructuring of Mexico's public health system in the early 1930s. But even after these reforms, I found that for the most part, indigenous women in Mexico City's hospital system especially experienced prejudice in the public health system. For example, in 1932, medical student Nava-Dominguez wrote the following. And I apologize if you can't see that text very well, perhaps I shouldn't have put it on the slide. But he wrote, oh good. He wrote, quote, "In Mexico, surgical sterilization was born with the desire to prevent women from with small pelvic measurements from giving birth. For many years, that was the only scientifically acceptable rationale for sterilization. Sterilization has expanded in subsequent years. But even today, Mexican doctors always experiment with sterilization techniques on women with small pelvises first. Following these preliminary experimentations, we then begin to use new surgical techniques on other women as well." Beatriz stated what some doctors had long referred to as, quote, "an open secret," that Mexican doctors had started to sterilize indigenous women primarily on the basis of their purportedly small pelvic capacities. And they used skeletal measurements in order to describe the pelvis of indigenous women and their descendants as downward and backwards, which were shapes that they considered primitive when compared to the European ideal. Thereby considered ill-suited for natural childbirth, indigenous women received higher rates of interventions during deliveries to compensate for this allegedly faulty anatomy. And so inferior pelvic anatomy was seen as a biological shortcoming that rendered them inadequate to further Mexico's bloodline. So this is an example of what historian Alexander Stern calls biotypology, which sought to classify human types based on a multiplicity of human capacities, even if scientists such as those in Latin America sometimes rejected outright racial categories in the way that Nava-Dominguez and Jose Vasconcelos did, which some of the scientists did, and so Karin Rosemblatt can talk much more about this than I can. But I'll mention, moving on from this subject, that we are lucky to have letters from women who complain about their treatment in hospitals because it gives us a sense of their experiences with scientific racism. When women complained, they didn't just focus on surgeries, they also focused on moments in which they felt that their dignity was violated. So for example, in 1929, this letter doesn't come from a woman herself, but rather from her husband, Juan Valdez, who complained to General Tapia that his wife's braided hair had been cut off during her stay in the general hospital, despite her vehement opposition. Since the shearing of her hair was not necessary for her medical treatment, one must wonder if the cutting of her braid, which was a common sign of indigeneity in Mexican tradition, was part of a defanaticization effort on the part of the hospital. If eugenic doctors saw indigenous women's bodies as obstacles to progress, it is also clear that they saw religion in the same way. And I'll note that this idea about the deleterious moral and cerebral effects of religion took root in the 1870s when physicians started to propose that contemplation could cause organic lesions in the brain. And now taking this idea through to the 1930s, the explanation became more culturalized. But it's well said by one particularly outspoken eugenicist who was named Gustavo Adolfo Tranguet, who insisted that eugenics was legitimized by a scientific grant of secular morality. In his words, religion has always been the most powerful enemy of science, and that which has most impeded its evolution. Now, it is perfectly understandable that the brainwashed masses would sacrifice their vitality and their well-being in order to honor the prejudices of a conventional morality and unfounded religious precepts. But if doctors possess scientific knowledge, with which, like laws of inheritance, they might legitimately impede the birth of children to sick parents, and if doctors rightfully take charge and help to inhibit the birth of infants to homes that are economically stable, if doctors were permitted to do their work well, they would help to avoid the onslaught of sick individuals who are incapable of the struggle for life. Indeed, it is ultimately the healthy and capable that society must support. Those doctors in some would act in agreement with morality, because morality is the science of well-being. So like others before him, Tranguet envisioned a priestly kind of obstetrician, one who would offer moral guidance to his patient. So this reminds me of what Professor Fallaw said about the anti-clericals being Catholic. In his words, he said, quote, "In the most intimate moments of medical consultation, a doctor lends his ears to the suffering of those who confide in him. They confide their health and corporal well-being to the doctor, and they also put their moral health in his hands as well. In this way, the doctor becomes kind of a priest." So this was an anti-clerical kind of guidismo in which the priest was a national enfeebler, while the revolutionary was a kind of Moses and a true priest. It is important to note that Tranguet's polemic reflected the views of some hospital administrators who also believed that religion had no place in the general hospital, and they revised the bylaws by 1828 to reflect that by stating that, quote, "No form of religious practice will be allowed in the hospital. In certain cases, administrators may grant permission for a patient to be visited by a minister of his or her religion. However, no other patient will be allowed to participate in any act of spiritual worship, nor will they be allowed to receive spiritual assistance. No religious matter will alter the schedule or functions of the hospital wing or ward." In 1934, the director of the General Hospital even banned all religious imagery from patients' rooms, an act which was consonant with the Caísta school policy too. And a postcard-sized image of the Virgen de Guadalupe was bound into the archival folder holding this notice because it had been confiscated from a patient in the fifth wing. At the same time, the head administrator sharply notified the heads of departments to keep better watch over the patients. During 3 times, many had been caught in the front garden of the hospital requesting alms. But those conflicts were all part of a larger nationwide effort to secularize and federalize Mexico's public health services. This happened in 1934 with the inauguration, really came underway in 1934 with the inauguration of Lázaro Cárdenas' 6-year plan for social and political reform. This was part of the effort to establish a network of federal rural schools with the aim of nationalizing, modernizing, and otherwise transforming Mexico's communities into scientifically informed and commercially productive regions. Yet the state could not do this without making steps towards improving public health and extending medical care to those without. And while this was an admirable goal, of course, sometimes even hospital authorities were motivated by projects of scientific and state control, such as those that have been described. So it's interesting because before the secularization and federalization of Mexico's regional healthcare, approximately 70% of the smaller hospitals were administered by local community committees, private boards of health and welfare, most of which had strong ties to the local Catholic left. The hospitals were run by, in large part, by religious women who performed the vast majority of patient care. I want to give just one example of how the secularization process made hospitals into battlegrounds for the soul of the nation. And this example comes from Veracruz, where the radical anti-clerical governor Alberto Tejeda legalized eugenic sterilization in 1932 in order to advance a revolutionary nationalism via the scientific management of animal people. The sterilization law, which was the only one of its kind in all of Latin America, authorized state-level boards to pursue the goals of Mexico's revolutionary government by ensuring, quote, "the conservation and betterment of the physical and mental state of its citizens." The legislation called for the regulation of reproduction and feasible applications of methodical eugenics, including legal sterilization of, quote, people with disabilities, and, quote, "those demented to such a degree that their defect is considered incurable or hereditarily transmissible in the judgment of the section of eugenics and mental hygiene." After acquiring the input of 3 medical experts, the section of eugenics and mental hygiene was authorized to identify particular individuals for sterilization. And in the 3rd largest city of Veracruz, which is Orizaba, the state had taken over the local administration of hospitals and clinics in order to enact this eugenic campaign. Although they had funding and support from the Rockefeller Foundation, they received substantial pushback from local authorities, some of whom continued to be involved in the local hospitals to a large degree. And so one result of this was a kind of a standoff in 1934, in which a group of almost 120 women were held in the obstetrics and gynecology ward of the municipal hospital for almost 6 months. So the ward had come under the purview of the state, but because officials could not agree on which of the women would receive which treatments, and because former Catholic administrators of the hospital publicized their discontent with the new authorities and with the public health campaign, which largely rested on coercion, the women, like I said, were held there for months. And so in the highly politicized context of post-revolutionary Veracruz, their unborn children were at the core of the struggle. So as I begin to conclude, I'd like to mention the response to eugenics from Mexico's Archbishop Pascual Diaz. Oh, there's some turn anyway. As I mentioned, in 1931, he penned what he called, quote, a spiritual campaign for Mexico's children, una campaña espiritual por la niñez mexicana. And in this writing, he spoke to Pius XI's 1930 encyclical, in which he defended the institution of marriage against the perceived threat of divorce, abortion, contraception, and eugenics. The opening lines of Diaz's pamphlet writing referenced the problem of, quote, demographic battle, or moral, social, and religious issues faced by nations, religious authorities, and common people. Of particular concern were those who expressed the desire to limit birth rates, as well as what he referred to as, quote, the missionaries of eugenics and divorce. And so, while Pascual Diaz and Pius XI very roundly condemned sterilization and made reference to specific abortive practices, what I also find interesting is that they were sympathetic to the plight of poor families who could not support more children. And that's a sentiment that I see in the writings of many Catholic medical students during the 1930s as well. Even though they were not eager to desacralize fetal life, as some of their colleagues were, or to go against religious bans on fertility control, they did sometimes seek to find solutions for their clients who sought to control their fertility. And one of these methods was very interesting and very Mexican. Mexican doctors appear to have been the only ones to have pursued it. And the method essentially consisted of finding a surgical way to occlude the cervix so as to prevent pregnancy without going against the Catholic community. So this represented a compromise amongst women seeking to control their childbearing, doctors who aimed to help them for humanitarian purposes, but also on the other hand for eugenic motives sometimes as well, and also a compromise for Catholics who oppose the use of fertility control, any kind of birth control. At the same time, many medical students who I haven't cited here resisted the very strong current of eugenic thinking and practice that I've shown was was becoming popular among some of their colleagues. So in some, the 1930s saw a struggle to define Mexico's approach to reproductive politics, fertility control, eugenics, scientific reform of society, and the role of religion in all of this. And as we have begun to see here, this battle for the soul of the nation took place in the context of hospitals and other places of healing throughout the nation, although much more research is needed on a local level in order to see exactly how the secularization of clinics and hospitals played out in different communities. So, but it was there in these hospitals that eugenics and fertility control became deeply divisive not only for politicians, but also for patients and medical students as well, because they represented the future of the nation and the obligations of the state to provide care for its citizens' bodies and souls. So in other words, debates about reproduction both reflected and contributed to debates about the meaning of the Mexican Revolution and concerns about how the new state would relate to its revolutionized citizenry in whatever way that might be.
Next up is Julia Young. Julia is Associate Professor of History at Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. She's the author of Mexican Exodus, Immigrants, Exiles, and Refugees of the Cristero War, a 2015 book. She is also co-editor of Local Church, Global Church, Catholic Activism in Latin America from the Rerum Novarum to Vatican II, also 2015. She's currently working on a new book on the Synergistas and right-wing Catholicism in post-Cristero Mexico. Today she's going to be talking to us about, quote, "The revolution is afraid," end quote, Cristeros and Sinarquistas in Mexico and the United States, 1926 to 1950.
Thank you, Karin. I'm going to sit. I hope that's okay. And I'm going to peek over at my slides. But thanks again to everyone for being here, and to my co-panelists for their fascinating papers. Karin. So the description of this conference states, religion is central to life in Mexico and Mexican America, and religious understandings and goals inform and energize politics, community lives, gender relations, migration, and more. And I think what I'm going to talk about today, I think that sentence sort of encapsulates what I'm going to talk about today, so that's convenient.
I wrote that sentence for that very reason.
So specifically, I would like to talk today about how Mexican Catholic partisans resisted the revolutionary government both within Mexico and from the United States from the 1920s to the 1950s. And I'm going to focus on two groups. First, the Cristeros, who fought, as we know, probably fought the Mexican government in a violent armed uprising from 1926 to 1929 and then sporadically in the 1930s. And then on the Unión Nacional Sinarquista, who attempted to establish an alternative to the Mexican government through nonviolent resistance in the later 1930s and through the 1940s. So I'll start with this image. The revolution is afraid, from the Sinarquista newspaper, El Sinarquista, in 1943. It shows a Mexican revolutionary falling backwards, terrified before the sight of a prayerful Mexican family, kneeling, praying with candles, with, I don't know what, maybe someone can help me, spirits or ghosts rising up behind them. And I think that I want this to be the title of my next book. We can maybe vote on that later. So the point what this indicates is that, or what I'll talk about in this talk, is that between the 1920s and 1950s, Catholic partisans were a major, consistent source of resistance to the Mexican revolutionary government, first the PNR and then the PRI. Why? Most people in this room will know, but it's maybe worth reviewing a little bit, that the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920 produces the Constitution of 1917, which contains anti-clerical provisions, specifically Article 3 that says the church can't operate schools or educate Mexican children, Article 27 that says the church can't own property or religious buildings and makes all that property the property of the state, and Article 130 that says that priests, nuns, and clergy can't express public opinions, vote, have the same rights as Mexican citizens, wear their clerical garb, or practice religion outside of the church. So as a result, Mexican Catholic partisans, and I call them Catholic partisans because 97% of Mexico was Catholic at this time. So as I like to remind people, this is really a Catholic versus Catholic conflict that we're talking about. So Mexican Catholic partisans are consistently opposed to the revolutionary government and to its constitution, and specifically to those three aspects of it. And their opposition is not limited to Mexican communities in Mexico, but also spreads across the border. So I'd like to talk, as I go through this, a little bit about the differences between the Cristeros and the Sinarquistas. And for my new project, I'm really interested in comparing the two. Obviously, I'll talk about the goals of each group. The Cristeros had goals, but the goals, as they articulated them, were mostly simply the overthrow of the Mexican government through warfare, the restoration of the churches, the reopening of the churches, and freedom of religion. The Sinarquistas articulated a much more expansive vision. They wanted the integration of church and state, and they tried to bring about that vision in daily life in Mexico. But importantly, they did that, they advocated doing that through nonviolent means. And then I also want to just reflect a little more on why it's important to understand that Cristeros and Sinarquistas were active in the United States as well as in Mexico. This is going to continue to be important in our conversations in the next couple of panels, obviously. First, I argue it changes our understanding of politics and conflict in Mexico. Because of migration, what happens in Mexico doesn't stay in Mexico. Migration from Mexico to the U.S. has a long history that predates this religious conflict and continues throughout it. So when people go from one country to another, they bring their politics with them. So migrants make Mexican politics inherently transnational. They are impacted by the politics of the homeland, and they impact the politics of the homeland. And then I think studying this also changes the way we think about migrants in the U.S. They're political, but they're also maybe more conservative, maybe more politically conservative, some of them. This isn't all migrants, this is a subset of migrants, than might be expected, or than a lot of the literature from much of the 20th century described them. That's really changing now in the historiography. So quickly, I'll talk about the Cristeros. I wrote a book about them, so will try to get through this part quickly. The Cristero War erupts in the west central, primarily in the west central heartland of Mexico, the colonial heartland. Matthew has told us a lot about why it was in that region and where. The conflict is later known as the Cristero War for the battle cry of the Cristeros, Viva Cristo Rey, along with Christ the King. People go to battle, wearing scapulars with under the Virgin, being blessed by the priests under the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So here she is being used for, they would say, her proper purpose then. So there's the Cristero banner. It's a very violent conflict. We don't know exactly how many people die. There are estimates between 90,000 and 200,000 people die in the countryside, including a number of priests. And these kinds of images circulated very commonly during the war. The priests who were killed, as well as the war dead, the soldiers, were considered to be Christian martyrs and are still venerated today by Catholics around the world. So this conflict spreads to the United States. This is the image from the cover of my book, a group of nuns coming into San Antonio. So as it becomes more and more difficult for priests and nuns to practice, to express their religiosity in public, there is an increased exile of religious clergy. About 2,500 priests and nuns, and then about a dozen key members of the Mexican hierarchy go to the United States during the war. And while they're there, they really work within the larger Mexican migrant community. And maybe later we'll talk about how that community developed and how many people there were, about 1 million at this time in the United States. They really worked in that community to strengthen the Mexican Catholic Church in the United States. They build churches. That's why many older Mexican parishes in the U.S. date to 1927 or 1928. They establish schools, they rebuild convents, so these groups of nuns that come sometimes establish themselves in convents, some of which still exist today. And these exiled clergy connect to the migrants that are in the United States, that are mostly from the region where the war is fought. Guanajuato, Michoacán, Jalisco, Querétaro, Bajío, and Los Santos and Jalisco. So these migrants have friends and family fighting in the wars. The new arrivals who are coming, they have direct experience of the wars. And so the Cristero War, the religious problem in Mexico, becomes a huge concern for Mexican migrants in the United States. And we see them, and this is really what I wrote my book about, becoming very active around the Cristero War. So here's a pamphlet calling on Mexican citizens to give all your money and all your blood to the cause. So I don't think they literally meant blood, but they participate in, so we see migrants participating in marches and rallies, participating in fundraising drives, establishing chapters of Cristero organizations, and some of them even attempt to smuggle guns, to launch rebellions along the border, and they coordinate with militants at home in Mexico. So their goals, as I said before, religious freedom, separation of church and state, the overthrow of the current regime, and they sort of throw their support behind anyone who will promise these things. Any exiled religious leaders in Mexico, from Mexico, who are in the United States. So De La Huerta, Estrada, Escobar, Felix Diaz, Gomez Serrano, whoever will offer them the possibility of living in Mexico. But do they win the war? Well, I'll spoil it. They do not win the war. And the church and the state reached an agreement in 1929 that, under the terms of which the Cristero militants have to lay down their arms. There's sporadic Cristero uprising throughout the 1930s, Fallaw writes about this, known as the La Segunda Cristiada, but again, spoiler, it never results in the overthrow of the revolutionary Mexican government. And so then the question is, what happens after this movement, after this Cristero movement fails or becomes weak? What happens when violent military uprising is no longer a possibility? And the answer is that Catholics sort of splinter in Mexico, and there are a number of Catholic activist movements. Acción Católica is one of them that was very important. Lay Catholic mobilizations. And so the one I want to talk about is the Unión Nacional Sinarquista. It's not the only one, but it becomes very important in the same region where the Cristero movement is called. So it's founded in 1937. It's a national Catholic organization that aims to bring about a Christian social order in Mexico and to challenge and overthrow the revolutionary government through peaceful means. It had, again, numbers are difficult, had maybe 500,000 members, maybe 100,000, maybe 700,000. They're really all over the place. I'm working on that. But if we look at, we do have some good maps. I'm sorry this is hard to see, but if we look at the map, and if you remember the one I showed you before, you can see that it's really concentrated in the same region of Mexico where the Cristero War was fought. But that there are, and this is very hard to see, but I'll just tell you, there are outposts. All the little dots on the map represent Sinarquista chapters throughout Mexico. So it really was a national organization. But again, with much more densely concentrated in that central region. It has a much more, I would argue, explicit vision for Mexican society than the Cristeros. Its main goal, main goals: to bring about a Christian social order in Mexico, to fight what it regarded as the disorder of the Mexican Revolution. It's called Sinarquista, meaning with order. It's fighting against the anarchismo of the Mexican Revolution. And then, and I'll come back to this, to fight communism abroad. There's also a very significant international scope to the Sinarquistas. So here we see, again, this is sort of for Ben too, but you can't see it, the Virgin of Guadalupe. She's important, she's right there. Guadalupe, the Mexican flag, and the Sinarquista flag. So they're very explicit about the kind of Catholic nationalism that they promote and that they represent. And here we have, they're really, also, they're more visual in some ways than the Cristero, or they produce a lot of visual material, which is really nice for historians. So a lot of the images I'm going to show you come from their newspaper at Sinarquista. So here we have an image that describes Sinarquismo as in front of the anarchy that invades Mexico, in front of the communism that threatens the country. Sinarquismo will defend the homeland and make a Christian social order. So what is that Christian social order? Primarily, it's the integration of church and state. At the top of the social order in Mexico is the church. Below that is the government. Below that is the bosses. So below that are the bosses. Below that are workers. And then the basic unit of society is the family. Very much patriarchal, heteronormative, not an appropriate word for that time, but family unit. With the father as the head and the mother as the obedient, compliant in that role. So gender is also important. Its leadership is, I'm sorry, in that slide really kind of, I like that because it's got that perfect Sinarquista family. And you see that image of the family crop up a lot. Its leadership is mostly middle-class men, upper to middle-class men. One of the most important is Salvador Abascal, who will lead the colonization efforts that I'll talk about in a minute, and remains a very important figure in Mexican politics. The center is the city of León, Guanajuato, which sometimes they describe as Sinarpopolis, city of Sinarquismo. So some of its goals, remember the Mexican Constitution, Catholic education. So here we have a slide, an image of the wolf threatening the child, and the wolf is Article 3. Right? So Sinarquismo's goal is to reclaim Mexican young minds from the threat of Lázaro Cárdenas's program of socialist education. And to that end, women play a here's if you can't read it, the chalkboard back there says, Los niños debemos amar a Dios y a la Virgen. Children should love God and the Virgin. So there's the Virgin again. And here we have children giving the Sinarquista salute. And sometimes it looked like this, and sometimes it looked like a Nazi salute. But this is very common for groups at this time. And then a major project also is to fight against the revolutionary program of land reform. The UNS envisioned a different kind of society. They were very opposed to state-led land redistribution, described that as communist and as something, as a foreign idea. And they envisioned a different kind of agrarian society guided by Catholic moral principles that would work cooperatively to farm privately owned land. And to bring this vision to fruition, the UNS established Catholic colonies. And typically we talk about 2 Catholic colonies, but this image, which I know you can't read, actually talks about 4 Catholic colonies. 2 of them may have been fictional. I haven't found much about those 2, but they claim to have María Auxiliadora in Baja California, Villaqino in Sonora, Santa María del Refugio in Tamaulipas, and San Miguel Arcángel in Durango. And if anybody knows about the latter 2, let's talk. But the largest and most well-known is, and here's a map of the 2 that I know actually existed. The largest was María Auxiliadora in Baja California. And there, colonists built a church. They built, and the church is this one. That's frequently reproduced in their images of colonies. 60 houses of palm and reeds. They called it a little city created by Sinarquismo in the middle of the desert. At one point, there were 55 families there. Almost all of them were from Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Querétaro, so these were migrants within Mexico. There were 70 men, 60 school-aged children, and 130 women and infants. They celebrated the births of children who were born after the community was established. There was a school with a teacher for boys and a teacher for girls, and they did agrarian work. That was, most of the families were occupied in agrarian work, and the land was supposedly divided out in this way that the Sinarquista, in a way such that it was still privately owned. So you see, again, in a lot of the images about the colonies, you see, I love this beautiful image of the horses and the plows, but you see those agrarian motifs. But religion sort of suffused the lives of the people in the colonies. They wake up every morning and they go to mass. They have strict dress codes. They had codes of behavior. When they greeted each other, they were supposed to greet each other with Ave Maria instead of Hola Buenos Dias. So the idea was that they would. So the idea of the colonies was that they would be the seeds of Sinarquismo, and that Sinarquismo would grow out from the colonies. Okay, Sinarquistas in the United States. So, like many conservative Catholics, the Sinarquistas lamented Mexican migration to the U.S. They saw it as a drain upon the Mexican nation, and they're also very nationalistic. So they didn't want to see the goods of Mexico or the laborers of Mexico going to the United States. So here's this is a political cartoon, and there's an article in El Sinarquista with the title that I think explains it well. It says, "Que ya nadie salga a los Estados Unidos." No one should go to the U.S. anymore. Good luck. This is 1944, so just before the Rosemblatt book. So by the early 1940s, thousands of Mexican migrants in the U.S. have become enthusiastic members of the organization. It seems to me now at this point in my research that many of them were the same people that had supported the Cruceros, that they kind of switched from Cruceros to Sinarquistas. I'm not sure the switch was quite so clear in Mexico. I'm not quite so sure that the lineage was so direct between Cruceros and Sinarquistas. I have, this map is a subset of that other map that I showed you, and it shows the UNS chapters in the United States. And this was shared with me by Nathan Elstrom, a graduate student who's working on a dissertation about Sinarquistas in the United States. So you can see that they're in the Southwest, and then if you can see, they're also in Chicago and the Midwest, so the places where Mexicans were. And here is a close-up of the Sinarquista ranches in Southern California. So they're really quite present there. And they're very, very important for the Sinarquistas in Mexico, because Mexicans Mexican migrants make more money, and the colonies desperately needed money to survive. And another spoiler alert, the colonies do not survive. They collapse after just a couple of years. But during the colonization drives, the Mexican migrant communities are incredibly important. Here's the Sinarquista branch. You can see the Sinarquista flag in the background in Los Angeles. It was one of the most important. And then I know you can't read this, but I just want to show that in the pages of El Sinarquista, you can see that when it says Noticias de toda la República, Estados Unidos is right there, included in the Noticias de toda la República. And so I actually think I want to argue or talk about how, for the Sinarquistas, the Mexicans in the United States were part of the organization, who were part of Mexico. And people talk about El México de afuera, the Mexico of outside. And in a way, they were outside, but they were also inside because they were in this organization. And with every issue, the newspaper mentioned the donations of all of the Sinarquistas across Mexico, but always, and again, I know you can't read this, always there were many from California, from Texas, and from Chicago. So we can actually see that the migrants were very important in donations, and therefore in the survival. Okay, 1 more minute. Okay, so legacies, very quickly. Why is this important? I'm just going to zoom through these pictures, very few. The Catholic activist movement remained important. I would argue it's still important on both sides of the border, although it's much more kind of blatant. This is Mount Cristo Rey, right outside of El Paso. It was built by Catholic activists in the 1940s, some of the same people that were Cristeros and Sinarquistas. It's still a holy site today. I just saw in the New York Times, people went there after the shooting at the Walmart. They just did a pilgrimage there. The Cristero War is still very much alive in Mexican memory on both sides of the border. This is the Santa Ana de Guadalupe, where you can go and do pilgrimages to the Cristero saints. The Unión Nacional Sinarquista is still around. It's got a Facebook page. Here's one of the images from the Facebook page, people celebrating its anniversary. And I mentioned Salvador Abascal and Abascal family, which remained very important in conservative Mexican politics. And then I'll just close with this and say that those of you who have been to Mexico will recognize it, but I think Sinarquismo and Cristerismo inform the kind of defensive posture that remains in the Mexican church, in some ways on both sides of the border, especially in Mexico. And that this is very important because some of these sort of more right-wing conservative movements are rising again today, especially in particular, and I'll close with this, integralism, the idea that church and state, that the state should be subordinate to the church. So this is coming, it's surging again in Mexico and in the United States in small Catholic circles, but vital and important ones. So, thank you. Someone in Pilsen?
Yeah.
I've got one in my office.
Thanks. And you were actually on time. Thanks to me. Next up is Matthew Butler, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of Popular Piety and Political Identity in Mexico's Cristero Rebellion, Michoacan, 1927 to 1929. It was published in 2004. And he's edited a volume on faith and impiety in revolutionary Mexico, which came out in 2007. Today, he's going to talk to us about Montezuma's Gold, U.S.-Mexican diplomacy, and the rebuilding of Mexican Catholicism, 1937 to 1972.
Many thanks. Also my thanks to John and to Julia there, and to the diplomats and all the institutions that have made this event possible. So thank you for that, and also for your time this morning. So I want to talk about Montezuma, the seminary, and essentially because it's an important response by Catholics to the Mexican Revolution, which, if it did anything, was to pose an existential challenge to the Catholic Church, using arguments well outlined by some of my fellow panelists concerning the fanaticism of Catholicism in Mexico. Thus it is that Catholic seminaries, preschools, which are required for every diocese since the 16th century Council of Trent, become important sites of cultural and political struggle in post-revolutionary Mexico. But simply, no seminaries, no priest of one generation from now, game over. This ominous prospect gave rise to some interesting transnational ventures in which Mexico's Catholic hierarchy outsourced the education of seminarians, young men pursuing vocation, to the United States. The idea clearly being to retain organizational autonomy over the clergy and prevent revolutions from strangling the Catholic Church at source by preventing it from renewing its personnel. Actually, there is a long history of this tradition of outsourcing in the Catholic world. There's the existence of Reformation-era seminaries in Spain, Salamanca, in France, and Douay, tells us. What's less well known is that the Mexican Revolution revived this particular version of Catholic migrant experience through the founding of two expatriate seminaries, one in Castroville in Texas in 1915, and another in Montezuma in New Mexico in 1937. That's the building there. It was a former railroad spa town, lost in the mountains of Las Vegas. It looks like we could have filmed The Shining there. Instead, they built a seminary there. It was a very important institution. For over 35 years, from 1937 to 1972, it returned well over 1,000 priests to Mexico, about 1,300, at a cost perhaps of some $5 million. It opened in September, say, of that year 1937. You can see very clearly, once again, this is a bilateral exercise, the Stars of Christ, alongside the Virgen de Guadalupe as the first cohort of Mexican seminarians, go off the train at the border and march their way towards Montezuma. So it's a very local visual image there. Montezuma was significant for many reasons, most of which I won't have time to go into. For one thing, it underscored the Mexicanization of the Catholic clergy in Mexico. For the first time in Mexican history, large numbers of seminarians received exactly the same education in exactly the same place, which had never happened before. Second, as a Jesuit-run institution, it promoted a Jesuitical, at this time, ascetic and socially militant religious outlook. There was a lot of emphasis on the kind of muscular Christianity. The seminarians were supposed to walk many miles to form catechism in New Mexican pueblos. They were supposed to play soccer and things like that, so the idea of investing disciplined bodies with pious strength was also very important to the project. Secondly, from the 1940s, Montezuma revived the Mexican Church's social project, which had really been abandoned at the end of the Cristero War, and it therefore provides a link between Cristero-era militancy and the popular church of the 1960s and 1970s. And this was especially so because Montezuma brought to Mexico grassroots innovations in Catholic pastoral thought, especially those of the French Ouvrier Catholique, the Catholic worker organization from France, which encouraged ordinary people rather than priests to Christianize their workplaces using the triangular see, discern, act, ver, juzgar, actuar methodology. And lastly, Montezuma matters because Montezumenses drove the church's post-1950 expansion in southern Mexico, indigenous Mexico, and along the Mexican-US border as well. It therefore combined to create a revitalized, militant, and comprehensively national church, and in some places a more progressive one. Still, the question must be asked, why care now about the apparently dry subject of a defunct cross-border Catholic seminary? Especially some historians discuss Montezuma as a kind of US imperial bridgehead, an example of hemispheric green paternalism. Some people will talk about Montezuma as an example of religious Monroeism. In the rest of my presentation, I want to suggest that Montezuma presents a more instructive religious diplomatic encounter and an instance of hemispheric convergence, one in which the Mexican church negotiated more effectively than and generally bested its US counterpart. So much so that for over 4 decades, the Mexican bishops retained managerial and academic control over Montezuma, while increasingly disgruntled US bishops picked up the tab. This is in spite of the fact that the original arrangement specified that Mexico would pay 50% of the seminary's running costs at the outset, rising to 100% within the first year. How was the Mexican Church able to achieve this coup of having a world-class seminary basically for free on its northern reaches? There are various reasons. Obviously, there were appeals made to the US bishops' sense of Catholic fraternity, which would only get them so far. The Mexicans also reverse-engineered Roosevelt's good neighbor policy and established alliances with the pro-Montezuma faction of American bishops who supported them against all comers. Those figures included Michael Curley of Baltimore, Francis Kelly of Oklahoma, Arthur Drossett from San Antonio. These are well-known figures to people who look at the Cristeros, and Julie writes about all of these people, I believe. But also especially John Mark Gann, who's a bishop area in Pennsylvania, who's the main spokesperson within the US Episcopal for Mexican interests. These figures were the Catholic equivalents of Roosevelt Schertz's ambassador to Mexico, Josephus Daniels, who was in fact another patron of Montezuma's, and that they framed Mexican aspirations very effectively in the US. More importantly still, the Mexicans opened more effective channels of communication with Rome. A particularly important figure here was the Archbishop of Morelia, Leopold Luis Flores, you see him sitting in the middle of that photograph there, who resided in San Antonio from 1932 to 1937, and being kicked out by the Mexican Revolutionary government for some outspoken promise that he'd made. Ironically, thanks to the Mexican Revolution's expulsion of foreign religious ministers, Luis Flores also happened to be the papal envoy, the apostolic delegate for Mexico. Put another way, Mexico's bishops had the direct ear of the papacy, the US's did not, or not so much, given that Luis Flores is line manager of the Vatican Secretary of State, no less. Lastly, the Mexicans possessed and sometimes used a nuclear threat, which usually sufficed for Rome to upgrade the US episcopate and call for greater generosity. Namely, that Mexico would repatriate the seminary and bring all of its young students home if Montezuma proved to be too costly to maintain. In the end, Mexico's diplomatic win should be understood integrally, therefore, as a result of diverse factors including Rome's desire to promote a socially engaged, Jesuit-shaped Catholicism, ecclesiastical factionalism and diplomacy, US good neighborliness, and the articulation of a strong international alliance that wanted Montezuma to thrive regardless of financial cost. The idea of creating an interdiocesan seminary was floated first in November 1935 when the Bishop of San Antonio, Drossett, compadre of Mexico's apostolic delegate, the wily Queretano, Luis Flores, approached the US Episcopate and urged its support for Mexico. The Committee on Mexican Affairs formed, which in time became known as the Comité Pro Montezuma, the Montezuma Board. It was soon filled by bishops who were militant pro-Mexico campaigners, Kelly Drossett. Luis Flores approached Rome and quickly won the support of the Cardinal Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pius XII. In this way, a transnational alliance was formed at the outset that would monopolize positions in the Montezuma Board and was in a position to influence Catholic opinion in the US, Mexico, and in Rome. Care was also taken to cultivate Roosevelt's government, which wanted to promote religious liberty but did not wish to intervene directly in Mexico. US Ambassador Daniels, a Methodist, was informed of the seminary project and supported it strongly to the extent that he lobbied before Cardenas's foreign minister, General Eduardo Hay, and asked that the seminary be constructed in Mexico. With the support, in February 1936, the Mexican bishops wrote a pastoral letter asking their US brothers to help, and in March both sets of bishops met in San Antonio. It was there that the Mexicans stated that their single biggest concern was the future education of priests, and therefore it was decided to build a seminary in the old railroad hotel at Montezuma. At this time, the Mexican bishops offered to pay $7 monthly for each seminarian, some so modest that it took the US bishops by surprise. They were further surprised when asked to supplement the amount themselves, and initially they thought this would be an impossibility. Eventually, the American contingent agreed to hold a national collection to pay for and recondition Montezuma, but in return they insisted on having absolute control, complete management of the seminary. Over the coming months, however, agreement was reached. In June 1936, in the first of several key papal interventions, Pius XI sent a personal check to Montezuma, and in July, a new committee of US bishops was founded under the chairmanship of Bishop Gannon, a true Mexican afán de corazón. As a rueful US Episcopate minute records, Gannon quickly internationalized the US Committee on Mexican Affairs, creating a transnational Montezuma board under the direction of the Pope and the delegate, being Luis Flores. That September, finally, a Mexican seminary Sunday collection was held that raised $500,000 for the project and bought the seminary in Montezuma. Gannon stirred up the faithful and described the Mexican bishops as Christ whose bodies bore the marks of revolutionary scourgings and evoked the biblical image of a church surrounded by packs of dogs. At a second meeting in San Antonio in April 1937, another agreement was reached, but only after a confrontation. At first, the Mexican delegation, led by Galileo Rivera of Guadalajara, argued that the seminary should exist for only 10 years. Angered, the US bishops refused to collaborate under these terms. Gannon himself jumped up and banged the table, crying that he wouldn't be responsible for paying for an improvised orphan seminary, as he called it. The Mexicans had to yield on this point, and we wanted it to be permanent. This concession, however, gave them the leverage to insist that the seminary should be run according to Mexican seminary norms, not American ones, which had been the US's initial demand. At the third meeting in Las Vegas, the New Mexican one, not the Nevada one, the Americans had to yield on the question of seminary management, seeing that it was a neuralgic issue for the Mexicans. Indeed, the Montezuma board minutes record Luis Flores deliberated with Gannon over what he called sensitive matters, two hierarchies involved, and communicated his fears of American dominance to Rome. Luis Flores also sent a set of proposed seminary regulations to the Congregation of Seminaries in Rome. The congregation, which was directly chaired by Pius XI, endorsed them, and the Mexican board of governors was then set therefore. This was a very good deal for Mexico. The seminary would now be permanent, but the US Church had assumed the burden of financing it and surrender control over its administration and its curriculum. But once it was evident that the majority sect in the US episcopate thought that Gannon had given too much away, at its assembly in November 1937, indeed, the American bishops ordered Gannon to make the Mexicans pay the lion's share of the cost instead. Some were not convinced by the Mexican bishops' protestations of post-Cristero poverty and said so behind closed doors at a meeting held in Montezuma in May 1938. It was at this same meeting that Gannon and Kelly, pressured by bishops such as Hugh Charles Boyle of Pittsburgh, moved that the Mexicans should now defray the running costs and create an emergency fund themselves. They proposed that pilgrims to the Basilica of Guadalupe should be taxed, essentially, and so should those from San Juan de Lagos in Jalisco. Right away, however, Luis Flores met with Gannon and gained his status as apostolic delegate to appeal to Rome. Though he promised Gannon in June that our aim and tendency is to maintain the Montezuma Seminary, he did so knowing that the Pope had his back. And indeed, on June 18, Pius XI sent a document to Gannon via the Congregation of the Seminaries, expressing his hopes for Montezuma's continued success and thanking the US bishops for their support. Suddenly, Gannon's problems disappeared. On 8th of July, he wrote to Rome saying that the Mexicans might contribute only what they could. The Holy Father should not concern himself because the Americans would now pay $60,000 every year for the seminary's upkeep. Gannon even asked the Congregation Secretary Consaldo to reassure His Holiness that he need not be worried. And it's also clear that Ambassador Daniels was involved at this time in pressuring the US Episcopate to continue supporting Montezuma. The Mexicans' weapons of the weak strategy, avoiding confrontation, then using back-channel diplomacy at Rome, worked well through the 1940s, and the funding formula, about $3 or $4 American for every Mexican one, did not change. And by the end of the 1940s, the US Episcopate paid several $1 million for the upkeep of the seminary. In the 1940s, essentially the same dispute revived. An attempt by the US Episcopate to get out from under the rock of paying for the seminary and the reassertion of Roman authority after a nationalist appeal by the Mexican Episcopate. At a joint episcopal meeting held in November 1946, the US Episcopate openly demanded that their Mexican counterparts now assume all costs over and above the usual annual subsidy, because they could not give more and would need to start reducing their contribution in order to fund post-World War II projects elsewhere. Gannon himself stood up now and said that Montezuma must be run like a business, not a charity. Once again, however, the Mexican bishops promised to pay more with special funds created at the popular shrines of Tepeyac and Lagos. When they reconvened in Mexico City in January 1947, however, they declared that the moment had come to transfer the seminary that was founded during the persecution from American to national territory, on grounds that the threat of persecution in Mexico had now ceased. The Mexicans flatly refused to pay more, and instead demanded that a more economical seminary be founded in Mexico. A letter from Miguel Darío Miranda, the Bishop of Tulancingo, in March 1948, makes the problem explicit. Montezuma had showered great benefits on Mexico, he wrote, and shown that God favoured the Mexican church. And now the time had come to close it, since the US bishops no longer seemed willing to host it as they had been at the start. This surely would bankrupt the Mexican church if it were left to pay for Montezuma by itself and prevent poorer dioceses, especially those in the south, from sending students to the seminary or indeed maintaining their own seminaries with grave detriment to the church, he wrote. The process of 1938 now repeats itself. US pressure, Mexican process, and then a decisive Roman intervention resulting in a defeat for the US, the US church that wanted to wash its hands of Montezuma. Luis Maria Martinez, the new Archbishop of Mexico and Apostolic Delegate, approached Rome, and in September 1947, the Congregation of Seminaries answered Martinez's petition with a Solomonic judgment. Montezuma must remain with no significant changes made to its funding or governance model without consulting Rome, given that the institution was built with papal blessing. The Mexican bishops now abandoned their plan to repatriate Montezuma, but probably did not mind since the US bishops were forced to reassure Rome that they had never meant to make their support appear anything conditional, and to promise that they would continue to fund the institution as always. Indeed, the American bishops now expressed a pious concern that their Mexican brothers, succumbing to a noble patriotism, had attributed too much good faith to Mexico's federal government in daring to believe that the time of persecution had passed. It was a question of principles, not money. Rome is now reassured. The annual subsidy from Montezuma must continue until Mexico's political constitution is amended in a way guaranteeing the Church's future. Rome thus forced the hand of US Catholics once again, criticizing signs of Mexican nationalism and American isolationism, but in a way that distinctly favored the Mexican bishops. So to conclude, the Montezuma Interdiocesan Seminary was built in a transnational field of religious and political forces, and its foundation set off a negotiation process between the US and Mexican churches, as well as their respective governments and Rome, which took 10 years to produce a hegemonic pact for accommodation. Ultimately, the Mexican bishops attenuated their own religious nationalism, asking the US for help and promising that they would not seek the repatriation of the seminary. Meanwhile, the US bishops were schooled in the art of being good neighbours. They had to accept that their economic support of Montezuma would be no less permanent and sizable than the seminary itself, and that waving a big stick at Mexico to demand payment was not going to work. With all of its defects, this hegemonic pact gave another 25 years of life to Montezuma, which was therefore a key factor in the development of the church in Mexico after 1940. In reality, Montezuma's gold turned out to be green. How is it possible that the much smaller Mexican episcopate prevailed in its dealings with the US? Well, for one thing, the mainstream US episcopate, with its bottom line, nation-centered, you want it, you pay for it approach, consistently underestimated the resolve of their Mexican brothers. They also underestimated Catholic Mexico's geopolitical importance to Rome and the extent to which Rome would favour Mexican interests in Montezuma. Rome wanted a seminary to weaken the red triangle of Mexico, Russia, and Nazi Germany. No matter how hard they pressed, and because they had the greater means, the US bishops were never going to escape paying for a seminary that was on US soil that enjoyed Rome's blessing as a hemispheric symbol, even if its students happened to be Mexican. Montezuma was not a one-off gift or comprehensible in national terms, as some US bishops seem to think. It was a transnational front, and since the human capital was Mexican, neither Mexico nor Rome had any compunction about asking the US for a contribution in cash. The main Mexican players, Flores Martinez, saw the Roman plan more closely and conformed to it more effectively. In a strange irony, it helped enormously in Mexico's revolutionary state by banning foreign religious personnel who made them papal envoys as well as local churchmen. It is obvious that they used this dual faculty to predispose Rome on various occasions, as we saw in 1938, 1946, 1947, and there were others which tipped the balance in Mexico's favour as well. On various occasions, the Mexicans surprised their US counterparts and forced rapid U-turns because they read and articulated papal intentions more easily. The US learned that in the Catholic world, Mexico was a lot more equal. It also helped that FDR's good neighbour policy had penetrated the US church, which in some ways was a weak hegemon and in some sectors a frank accomplice of Mexico. The bishops who got themselves onto the Montezuma board viewed the seminary as an instance of good neighbourism, not a charity and still less an imperial project. Ghana, for example, was invited to address the Inter-American Marian Congress in 1945, which proclaimed the hemispheric patronage of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and began his speech with the prize of Viva Mexico. He even suggested that Roosevelt's foreign policy conformed to a providential plan, and prophesied that good neighbourism, buena vecindad, will achieve perfection when it is illuminated and fortified by Jesus Christ. Other examples of this kind of informal American style of Mexican patriotism. There was therefore a powerful group within the US episcopate that was willing to produce Rooseveltian good neighbourliness into a Catholic Good Samaritan equivalent. Some of these bishops were of Irish origin, Colby, Byrne, Gannon himself, and in all seriousness, they argued that Americans should show solidarity with Mexico, as Spain and France had once done with Ireland in penal days. For some, Mexico's martyred Catholics were exemplars to be imitated. In Curley's Extension magazine in September 1937, for instance, Gannon told American readers that Mexicans were not a people apart, that their hermanos in Cristo would learn the hard way, unlike Americans, what faith was really worth. Only in a limited sense, then, do the negotiations between Mexico and the US correspond to two clearly defined national positions. Rather, there was an alliance between the more Montezumense sectors of the American and Mexican churches. In these depressing war-building days, what Tutino stands is an interesting case for appreciation. Thank you.
We are now going to open the floor to questions and comments, and I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and open things up with a comment maybe some of you can elaborate on. What emerges for me from this panel as a whole is, I don't quite know what the word is, but the militant, perhaps litigious, argumentative nature of the Mexican Catholic Church. And so I wonder, do we attribute this to the overall conflict-laden nature of post-revolutionary Mexico, or are there some more long-term aspects of the church's own history dating back to the, to the independence struggle, or maybe even back to the Bourbon reforms, that are kind of fueling this conflictive or conflict-seeking Catholic Church? Then I wonder, for those of you who are working on the U.S. side of the border, how does the extension of the church into the United States perhaps affect that? I mean, is the effort to extend into the United States perhaps an effort to get around some of that? Or is conflict also very much present within the U.S. outposts of the Mexican church? And then I'm wondering, for the people working more on the Mexican side of the border, I mean, we know from some of the work on Chiapas by Jan Rus and Steve Lewis about the conflicts, village-level conflicts that are spawned between Catholics and Protestants. And none of you mentioned really Protestants, which somewhat surprised me. But I'm wondering the kind of conflicts that you're describing within hospitals or just within the national political realm, is that outside of Chiapas, or is that also infusing village-level politics? So that's a sort of series of questions I have. And then, the other thing that kind of jumps out at me from these papers is really the strength of a national church, right? And the way that this is very nationalist church, despite the fact that it reaches outside of Mexico, but its symbols are very much national symbols, and it's battling the secular position from its own nationalism as well. So.
I can start on the when did it start. I recently tried to write a history of church-state conflict in Mexico for the Oxford Historical Encyclopedia, and I just kept going back, right, to the European Middle Ages at least, right, because conflicts over kings and church, and then finally I had to stop going back and just start in Mexico. But I mean, certainly there was, you could think about the expulsion of the Jesuits or the Bourbon reforms, right, the Bourbon reforms and the expulsion of the Jesuits, just conflicts over jurisdiction. I mean, or over the control of Mexico. And one thing I always talk to people about, because I'm talking about church-state conflict in Mexico, often to U.S. audiences, is that it's just a completely different landscape in Mexico. This is a place where there was no separation of church and state, and so the conflicts between church and state are just fundamentally of a different nature than we understand them to be here in the U.S. So yeah, they have a deep history that goes back, and there's also written about this that goes back to the colonial period, but then especially into the 19th century and the reforms, and through the Porfiriato, and so the Cruzero Rebellion is just, a specifically more violent outbreak in this much longer history. And then, if I can jump to your question about nationalism, I love this topic so much, and Ben's paper talks about the pantheon, right? Who are your heroes? In Mexico, sort of tell me who your heroes are, and I can tell you what side you're on, if you're conservative or liberal or revolutionary or Catholic, right? So if your heroes are Iturbide, right, and I don't know, when you celebrate Mexican independence, for example, do you celebrate it with Iturbide or do you celebrate it with Hidalgo? And so, so each side, there's no historical figure that's neutral exactly. Like, they're all contested in this long conflict between church and state. So it's really interesting, and constantly with the cristeros and anarchistas, you see them talking about these are our heroes, not Hidalgo, not necessarily Hidalgo, not Juarez, but Hernán Cortés or Cristobal Colón, or they're very Hispanified. So the people that brought Christian to Mexico, and then Iturbide is the independence story, and then let's not talk about Juarez. So yeah, it's continuous.
All right, let's. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, I would say, there are some, I think, concerning your first question about when does the tension really begin, and there was very deep roots, there are also some more medium-term, conjunctural things. One thing that we've been very good at in more recent times is seeing the Romanization of the Mexican church, which is an extremely important phenomenon which really set us off in the second part of the 19th century. In response to various things, to the Roman question itself, which sees the Vatican trying to bring its local churches closer within its grasp. The liberal reform in Mexico, which created this kind of fracture, really, that the long tradition of church-state union now wasn't going to be possible anymore. So it was a very powerful process of centralization in the Mexican Catholic Church. And also a commitment to a kind of very assertive Catholic sociology, which starts to come in around the turn of the 19th century, really in response to William of Berkeley, probably 13. And we get this very powerful kind of Mexicanization, Romanization effect, if you like, with the development of the Cristo Rey phenomenon, the way that these modern, more cosmopolitan Catholic imports become bonded with particular kinds of local religious practice in Mexico, especially in places like the Bajío, Jalisco, those kind of places. That's a very important process itself. I think also the experience of the Mexican Revolution is slightly radicalizing as far as Mexican Catholics are concerned. They do feel, for the first time in a long time since before the Porfirio Diaz regime, that there is a mortal existential threat to their religion, to the institutions. And it encourages a kind of super radicalization in the 1920s and 1930s, which is extremely important.
Great, thank you. Do you want to say something? No? All right, let's open this up to the floor. We'll have Evan and then John.
First, thanks to everyone. This is a wonderful panel. Matthew, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relocation of the seminary, when it moves back to Mexico in the 1970s. And is this a product of sort of a change in the way that the Mexican bishops and the U.S. bishops are cooperating? Is this a different landscape in a post-conciliar world?
Yeah.
Is this Pedro Arrupe changing the mission of the Jesuits, right, who are in charge of this seminary? And
yeah,
what's going on?
Well, I think by the 1970s, there was a growing feeling that Montezuma had essentially served its purpose, at least from the perspective of the Mexican bishops. There'd been, by that point, 30 years of relative tranquility in church-state relations. Most dioceses have now rebooted their own diocesan seminaries, which is what they were saying they were trying to do. Like, even in some cases in the 1940s, they were saying, well, Montezuma was great, but it's stopping us from doing that. But the 1970s, that had occurred much more determinedly. So I think there wasn't the same desire to maintain Montezuma anymore from the perspective of the Mexican side. The US side was really quite glad to stop having to sign checks and keep going, because they'd spent millions and millions of dollars on this and been outplayed at every turn of the at that point. I think you can still see that Montezuma's a very influential institution for the Mexican church from that point. Lots of dioceses in southern Mexico and northern Mexico, their bishops are former Montezumanistas, they bring a certain radicalism to the practice of Catholicism in Mexico. So I think the long-term significance is down to Montezumanistas themselves, rather than the debates about the seminary where should have gone, and so on. Actually, the library ends up in the Universidad Pontificia in Mexico City, the whole thing gets shipped, that's now the library there. But the influence of Montezuma's really felt in individual dioceses and individual parishes. But if you understand the way that the Mexican church fills out the national geography of Mexico after 1940 without thinking about Montezuma. I'm not even sure you can understand the impact of liberation theology in Mexico without Montezuma. So dioceses like Cuernavaca, Morelos, Chiapas, Oaxaca, Puebla, places that we associate with a particular kind of interest in liberationism, those have been dioceses where a lot of Montezumensis have turned out and become religious. So it does have a long time significance. That's really what I see.
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, say, I learned so much. I want to just raise a couple of things that really are kind of framing, and they come from the fact that I looked at this from earlier periods at this. And the first thing I want to say is, Ben's comment, almost like, could this be anti-clerical Catholics? And what I want to say, that's the norm in indigenous Mexico from the early contact period right through the 19th century. Indigenous people are insistently and proudly Catholic. And if the priest collaborates, fine, worked pretty well during the era of the Franciscans in rural parishes. When secularization comes, you read the community records, the priest is now a hired hand. We will pay you a fee to do the mass, but we want it said, now get out of the way while we do our festivity. So in that central southern, and that fuels into other things. So we talk about, and I'll get back to this in a minute, this being revolutionary and or post-revolutionary Mexico. I have a problem with how we deal with that. Because if you look at the revolutionary factions, and it was a war of factions, Zapata's movement is the perfect manifestation of this world in which you have deeply self-identified Catholic movements who want nothing to do with any clerical or church leadership. They go into battle with the image of Guadalupe on their hats, etc., etc. Villa is famously pro-clerical and would have nothing to do with this anti-clericalism. So the anti-clericalism does not come out of a full-blown conflict of the Decade of Revolution. It comes out of the fact that these reformist, former liberal, upper class developmentalists have crushed the popular movements. And they have called themselves the revolution and have then identified this anti-clericalism with their meaning of the revolution. And I'll cynically say, had there been any meaningful Zapatista of the East of present Querétaro when the Constitution was written, highly improbable that any of this anti-clericalism would have been enshrined in revolution. And I'm going to just note in the way this goes on, and I actually don't remember how Elizabeth phrased it, so I'm going to leave you out of this, but that on the left of the table, both Karin and Ben talk about the 20s and 30s as post-revolutionary, very clearly. And on the right of the table, Matthew and Julia talk about this as the revolutionary government and the revolutionary regime. And I think that's a conversation we need to have. And you've heard my leanings. I think this is clearly a post-revolutionary government. And I've been known to argue and actually anger some people off. Within my view, the Cristeros are another popular revolutionary mobilization, more like the Zapatistas and Partidistas than like the people who call themselves the revolution and won. Popular communities committed to a reforming vision, deeply religious, yes, they have also pretty programs. And I suggested that in a passing in my first book, and I really pissed Alan Knight off. I thought that was
I'm stimulated by what you said, John, and still, these were wonderful questions, Karin, as well, which will keep me busy. Sleepless nights, thinking about all of these really very productive questions, so thank you. So, back to John's question, which I think is really good. And a good place to sort of get a chronology and the importance of the revolution. I tend to agree with Matthew. The revolution does overshadow everything that came before. And the Cristiana. And the death toll, I'd say, is, I see 100,000, but I don't think that counts a lot of people who died in the reconcentration camps that we use. Of some aerial bombings, and even there's reports of poison gas, which have never been confirmed, but I think that the level in that part of Mexico of violence left a really lasting impact. So back to John's question, Zapata, I found an account, I haven't confirmed it, Zapata tried to exercise the patronato and appoint a bishop, or one of the generals did. Now that's hard to track down. Villa, I think, is a little more complicated. I think he became pro-clerical to take advantage of the popular sentiment in Jalisco against Carranza's anti-clericalism. So it was sort of an opportunistic defense of the church. I believe Villa bitterly hated Spanish priests. And but that again is not unique. I mean, in Yucatan, Salvador Alvarado found Mexican priests who had grievances and tried to exploit divisions within the Yucatecan clergy with limited success. So that's real. But in terms of this difference between Villa and Zapata versus the constitutionalists who become the Callistas, who become the Cardenistas, I'll just tell an anecdote about Felipe Quiraporto. Felipe Quiraporto, the great Yucatecan socialist leader, pretty anti-clerical, goes to Muxupip, a small town outside of some town, very Maya-speaking, and he wants to close the cantina because he's a strict prohibitionist. So he gets the women of Muxupip together, they form a social liga, and they turn in a petition, and he says, okay, this is a popular demand, the cantina's closed. So then the men get together, and they're Liga de Resistencia, and they write a petition, let's kick the priest out. So Carrillo Porto says, great, I have a popular demand. Now, the priest is out. So I think revolutionary politicians, and Carrillo Porto, I think, was a sincere, genuine intellectual who thought a lot about the shape of Mexico that he would like to see. But he had definitely exploited, again, what I referred to somewhat awkwardly as this gender gap that existed in Mexico. And the more I think about Guadalupe, and there's two people who know a lot more about Guadalupe, Alicia, and Soto, we're going to talk later today, so I'm a newcomer to this. I think it is very difficult to separate it from the fact that male revolutionaries were deeply threatened. Eddie Rios has written about this, and I think Elizabeth referred to this elsewhere, that women, along with indigenous people and sort of criminals, bandits, were the enemy, and their project was to reform or contain all of it.
Okay, I'm just adding, we now know from a recent doctoral dissertation when we went to teaching in Connecticut, Villa was absolutely happily pro-clerical during his occupation of base in Monterrey and alliance with the Madero family, and he built this up. So he is starting to look like ready to compromise with the church.
I say one.
Sure,
Sorry,
please.
one more thing about the revolution, just very short.
Yeah.
Just revolutionary versus post-revolutionary. For the scene, I don't know so much for the Cristeros, but for the anarchistas, they were fighting the revolution. They always referred to it as the revolution, right? And that was their language, and that was the revolution was the anarchy.
Was the
And then
state.
so, yeah, it was the state.
And that's my argument. The revolution was first claimed by the victors. They said, we are the revolution, and they got away with it.
Right,
And they had crushed and killed Zapata. They crushed and killed Villa. And then they say, we're the revolution.
Right,
That's, to me, is the sequence we have to follow, and then they shape the language going forward.
yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to, I'm the librarian and archivist for the U.S. Bishops Conference, and we have digitized the news feeds from 1920 to 1985 that are freely available. This covers this period of time. We're working on doing more of the newspapers, and we're doing the annual reports from the Bishops Conference, as well as the early bulletins. It's a great resource, it's free, and we hope that historians and scholars will use it. And there are flyers out on the table, and I've got them here too.
Go archivists. Didn't think a lot of historians have it. Other comments, questions? Yes, in the back. Yes.
I have a question. For those people that want to, especially first, second generation Hispanic young people, is there a resource, a book that discusses Mexican history and includes quite a bit of this but in English, because obviously they're not going to get this in school in history, right? Because we study American history and Mexico always gets left out. So is there a resource that you guys recommend, or a book, or books, or a website?
All of the above.
Julia's writing that book right now, so.
Your book. Okay. Well, if you're looking for like a broader history,
Yeah, it hasn't
especially
been
for like
synthesized.
maybe college age, there's a textbook by Sarah Klein and Javier Pescador on the history of Greater Mexico, right? Where it's Mexican history, but going into the Mexican diaspora and borderlands.
Yeah,
And it was Ruiz writing one too. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm a little bit out of my league here, but I think for a general overview of the Mexican Revolution, a book by Gil Joseph and Jürgen Buchenau gets you into some of the overall conflicts within the Mexican
But
Revolution.
keep in mind, in that book, Zapata is a counter-revolutionary. Explicitly. Check it.
I knew I would get chastised.
It's otherwise brilliant.
I'd be happy to give you more, if you give me your email, I can send you book
Oh,
recommendations.
thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, yes. And
I have two comments. The first one about the Virgen de Guadalupe. I think it's an archetype that is built against Madre Matiana. Yeah, Madre Matiana is basically the other side. You know, the prediction when the Americans invade Mexico, so on and so on, is the way of the 1920s revolution. That's basically the other archetype. I think they are fighting. And two papers so young about Vasconcelos. Vasconcelos, when he published Raza Cósmica, he published in Spain in a Falangista publisher. And then later on he became a Nazi supporter. And he later on wrote the introduction to Borrego, who is like the Bible of the Sinarquista movement. So you see how Vasconcelos more like, I think the Falangismo really influenced directly the Sinarquismo. Because the way that Vasconcelos is publishing overseas, isn't even though in the US, in Chicago, he gets more, and more into the Raza Cósmica became more like Aryan Raza. And I think Vasconcelos will be the leading person because he goes all the way from 1912 or 1910s all the way to 1950s. And Abascal and him, they were good friends. So I know.
Yeah, Vasconcelos is kind of like a unique figure on who is threads between on different sides of the revolution and writes a really incredible autobiography at the end of it all, as so many of his figures did. But I just wanted to quickly, I sort of skipped over when I was talking about the question that I get a lot when we talk about the Sinarquistas, which is, well, were they fascist or were they not fascist? You know, because 1944, or 1937 to 44, you know, and they, you know, they said that they weren't. They insisted that they weren't. They insisted that they were not anything but a Mexican movement, and they rejected all international movements. Yes, they had the armbands. Yes, they had the, you know, the duck walk, the goose stepping. Sorry, not duck walk. I shall say. But they also were a pacifist movement. You know, they were materially different. They were strange. It didn't fit with. And what I'd like to eventually argue, I think, is that they're really more of a Catholic integralist movement than they are a fascist movement. And they certainly, they attract a ton of information, of attention from the international media, U.S. media especially, who call them Nazis. They're like a fifth column, and they're kind of a Fallaw or they're Nazis. And they always said that they weren't. And I think that they actually weren't. I think that they were something different. But they were certainly, Abascal admired Franco, but explicitly said that he was not trying to recreate that in Mexico. So.
And then Joseph Tony, this Jesuit priest who's coming from Georgetown, he's a man who wrote about against Mexican agrarian reform and later on Franco. He's like the ideology of this American movement Franco, and he's a man who's really an intellectual, in the Cuban Revolution and all. That's another character who's here in Washington. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to your opening comment about guadalupanismo, and that was talked about in Ben's paper, I think that we also have to remember that in Mexico there was a 300-year state church, and even now we've only got 200-year stateless church in Mexico. So you've got 100 years to go until we balance the scales out. So it's not surprising we get these, not church and state, but these kind of church-state formulations, the very paradoxical ones sometimes being thrown up. I think the Guadalupe thing is a really obvious example of that, the way that where the Mexican pre-regime utilizes the Guadalupe tradition. It speaks to a national imaginary that everybody understands. It's something that the state can use as a kind of church-state formation in many ways after the revolution. And the building of the pact between the church and state is often carried out through a kind of Guadalupe language. I think you can take that all the way back to the revolution. John mentioned the Zapatistas with the little icons of the Guadalupe on their heads. The movement I've been studying, the Mexican Revolutionary Catholic Church, that was created in the 1920s, they do exactly the same thing. The revolutionaries learned to co-opt popular santos and devotions in Guadalupe to one of those things. So, yeah, we do get these very paradoxical identities.
I also want to say that, many of you focused on the way the revolution adopts certain aspects of Catholicism, but I think we also have to pay attention to the other side, which is how Catholicism itself becomes secularized, right? Not because of the Mexican Revolution necessarily, but just because of the rise of science, would be the way I would think of it. So with that, I think we will bring this incredible session to a close and head to lunch.
Lunch.